I would love to start out first with just finding out how many of you are familiar with constitutional iridology. If you are familiar with constitutional iridology, give me a yes in the comments box. Can you find the chat box there and just give me a yes if you're familiar with this? I'm not asking, are you professional, but just are you familiar with it? Okay, so we've got people who are a little familiar with it, some who are not really familiar with it. This is great. We're going to keep this at a really high level today because we want to make sure that everybody gets something that they can use. I'm going to encourage you also, as you have questions about the topic we're talking about, which is eyes changing, if you would feel free to drop those into the comments box as well. And if I can work them into our presentation, I will. So the question today is, do irides change? Do irides change? And the answer is absolutely. They can change, but they don't necessarily change the way so many iridologists teach. And with this, I'm going to show you examples of what I mean. We're going to look at lots of cases of eyes, and we're going to talk about the types of changes we may see, the types of changes we do see. As we do this, I want to remind you that this information is for your education only. And as a result, we're not diagnosing, we're not prescribing. You are responsible for any results you get, whether it's good or bad, that come from using this information. Now, just as we launch into this, I want to warm you up a tad. This is what one of my recent students said. She's actually just finished her certification process with the International Iridology Practitioners Association. But this is what she said about the course. I'm excited and thrilled to be in this class. I am a certified functional nutrition counselor with a healthcare background. I thought with all the anatomy and physiology classes I've taken in the past that I knew a lot about the body, but I am learning so much more. She wrote this about halfway through her coursework. Judith is a wonderful teacher, so knowledgeable and patient with my endless questions. I would recommend her class to anyone and can't wait until I certify and can practice iridology. She's certified with flying colors, love it, and she is just getting ready to set up her business. I'm so pleased with her progress. If that sounds interesting, again, just another heads up, the next course is starting on June the 8th. And enrollment is only by having a private one-on-one Zoom meeting with me. I want to make sure the course is a good fit for you and that you have the necessary prerequisites, which we're going to talk about in a moment. I only accept 10 students per class. And when that roster is full, we start a wait list for the next start date. So how do you prepare to learn iridology? I know we are going to talk about changes in a moment, but we need to first learn how to prepare to learn iridology. There's one qualification that all of my students have to have before I allow them to enroll. They must have completed a college level anatomy and physiology course. Now that's important because we're going to go into the reasons why in just a moment. But the kinds of things that would qualify for this, if you are a registered nurse, currently licensed registered nurse, currently licensed EMT, currently licensed ND, currently licensed MD or RMT, you just need to show your license to IPA when you're certifying and they will take that. If you don't have that, then you need to show proof of a college level anatomy and physiology course as a separate course. It could be within the context of a larger program, but it has to be a separate course. You might need to provide an outline of the course as well as your grade showing an 80% or better. So why do we need to have that anatomy and physiology under our belts already? And it's because having that allows us to go so much deeper than one marking equals one problem. We don't want to be stuck with one marking equals one problem. We really want to be able to think through an eye. I don't know why this is stuck in some blank slides. Having A and P also helps us understand organ pathways, connections, and interactions more fully. And it is that understanding that then allows us to create logical sequential programs for our clients rather than throwing everything that we know at them in one go. This is so important to understand how the body works, how the body organs link together, and how one affects the next, affects the next, affects the next, right? Because if we don't understand that sequence, we can't do iridology well. So with that, let's look at how some eyes have changed. I need you to really pay close attention to this. Look at this set of eyes. Okay. I want you to burn this into your memory because we're going to look at some after photos of him. This is a man, he was in his 40s when I met him the first time. These were the first eye photos we took of him. So look at these photos. These are photos we took about 18 months later. About 18 months later. Now, what has changed? What has changed in his eyes? I'd like you to type in some ideas. What do you think has changed? I'm going to show you his images side by side. Deanne says the color has changed. Interesting. Interesting. It does look like the color's changed. Absolutely. What else do you think has changed? Color in more lacunae. Brown spots. I love that you're looking really closely at these. This is so good. What I want to really point out is what has changed is the camera and the lighting. The image on the left, which were the first images, were taken with an 8 megapixel digital camera. At that time, 8 megapixels was state of the art. Now we laugh at that your smartphone is better resolution than that, right? 8 megapixels. This image on the right was taken with a 24 megapixel digital camera. And it also has a different lighting source. Notice this light is an incandescent ring flash. This is an LED flash. Incandescent is very yellow, which is going to give the whole image a more yellowish tone. LED is more blue, which is going to give us more bluish tones. You can even see the difference in the sclera color. The changes that you see here are entirely due to the technology changing. Vienna commented that the image on the right looks clearer, and it does because it's 24 megapixels as opposed to 8. What you see in here, that looks like it's just a dark shadow. When we have higher resolution, is actually little dots of pigment and patches of pigment. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why I get really concerned about people on Instagram saying things like, oh, I've done this all fruit, all raw cleanse, and look at my eyes are so much clearer. One of the things you have to do is you have to look at the images to see, were they taken with the same camera? Because if they were not taken with the same camera, with the same lighting, then the before and after comparison is invalid. Okay. And Jessica says maybe the spacing of the black in between the white lines is different. And that's going to be variable based on pupil size. When we look at pupil size, the fiber structure that we see in the iris, those fibers are a certain length. As the pupil gets bigger, the iris tissue compresses, but because the iris fibers don't telescope, they have to get wavier, and that's going to make it look gappier between the fibers. When the pupil is small, it stretches the fibers out, and that makes it look like there's less space between the fibers. Okay, so that's a really important observation to make here. Again, when you're looking at before and after photos, don't believe everything you see. Look to see if you can tell if it appears to be the same camera on the same settings. That's your first qualifier, right? And if it's not, then you can't say a change has happened. I've had some people who've studied with various other iridology instructors who say before and afters happened. They sent me photos that were clearly taken with different cameras. and they call me a poor iridologist. Well, I don't name call. I just tell them they don't understand technology. So, and that's a true fact here. Even with the camera on the right, if we took repeated photos and we tired out the batteries, we spent the batteries so the flash was not as strong, that will alter the image output. So a lot of things to consider here. Now, I'm just giving you that food for thought before we talk about changes. How do I know this? Why am I so confident in this? Because I've been in the industry for 4 decades. I'm a master herbalist, a natural nutrition clinical practitioner. I'm also a level 3 certified iridologist with IFA and a level 3 certified iridology instructor. Now, IFA makes us, to keep our credentials, do updates every 2 years. So my most recent badge will expire in January 2024, but I've been a certified iridologist for many more years than these 2 years that are listed here. So instead of the question of do eyes change, the quality of the question determines the quality of the answer, right? You've got to ask good questions to get good answers. So a better question than do eyes change is, what changes can we see in irides and what do those changes mean? Do you agree with me that this is a better question? When we talk about irides changing, when I first started studying iridology 40 years ago, is that older than some of you on this call maybe? I was taught that the eyes would change if we changed the diet, if we did the right herbs, that we would see all kinds of things happen. And I believed that for nearly 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, I was frustrated. I was not seeing eyes change. I was designing programs. My clients were following programs. They were working hard. And we were not seeing the eyes change. And I began to doubt everything I'd learned and to think, this is garbage. It's just myth. There's no facts behind this. And that was when I learned about constitutional iridology. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. And that's when my constitutional teacher appeared. And it had a very different take on the concept of eyes changing. And that catapulted me forward, and I've never looked back. And we're going to talk about those changes. One of the changes that we can see is that pigment may be acquired or may become more dense. Now, this is not, pigment doesn't develop in the eye because of toxic exposure. It doesn't develop because you've got heavy metals. It doesn't develop because you've used sulfur-based antibiotics. It doesn't develop because you've got a lousy diet. Pigment develops based on genetic cues. My hair hasn't always had this much gray in it. That gray didn't come in because I didn't eat enough of the right vegetables. It came in because my genetics said, at about this time, within this age range, you're going to develop gray hair. Right? That was genetic. That is the same with our eyes. Now, the big difference when we look at this is as we see pigment developing in an eye, it tells us what the genetics are that might be creating an imbalance in an organ function at that point in time. So these photos were taken about 20 years apart, different cameras, right? So this was my very first iridology camera. It was a print film camera, beautiful camera. It got stolen when my office got broken into. I was very sad when that happened. But we know this is the same eye. We look and we see a lacuna at the top. We see this lacuna at about, at about 52 minutes inside the collarette. We see a little lacuna outside the collarette about, about 15, 22 minutes. It's right here. It's very thin. Notice the difference in the size of the pupils. So that is going to stretch the fiber out when the pupil is smaller, which is going to make these look narrower. They have not healed. This is simply a function of how the fibers behave as the pupil expands and contracts. Does that make sense? If that makes sense, give me a makes sense in the comments box. As we look at the older image, We look down here from about 30 minutes to most prominently 30 to 35 minutes in what we would consider to be zone 3. 20 years ago, there was no pigment. More recently, we have this pigment. So when we see pigment like this, the color tells us which organ wants to be out of balance, which organ wants to be the troublemaker. The placement tells us which organ is going to suffer the most for that imbalance. So the pigment gives us two pieces of vital information. Where's the imbalance and what's being affected by this? We could put this gentleman on high-powered liver cleanses or whatever cleanses would be appropriate, and we're not going to wash this pigment out. It is there for good now. It's like my hair is not going back to its natural color unless I do it artificially. This fellow could go in and get laser color treatment for his eyes to change this, but that's not going to change what's going on in his genetic structure. Interesting that this is a liver colored pigment. And this gentleman over the past few years, he's in his mid-60s now, has developed very itchy skin, which correlates very strongly to liver imbalances. And we continue to work to support his liver to try to reverse that symptom for him. Here is another set of eyes, again, 20 years ago with that original camera that got stolen, and 20 years later, so a 20-year gap between these. A lot of people, again, would look at this and say, wow, the image on the right, clearly it's got less yellow in it. Clearly he's done cleansing. No, he hasn't. These were taken when he was about 8 years old. These were taken when he was about 28. I assure you, in that intervening time, this is one of my sons, once he left home, his diet did not improve. As a matter of fact, it really tanked. By the time he was about 28, he was starting to get his life organized again and was doing better with his food choices. But I assure you that in those intervening years from about the ages of 16 to about 24, he probably was really, no, he was absolutely really hard on his body. All right. So when we see this, look at this very, very carefully. You go, are they really the same eye? Let's look for some markings that are the same. Okay, so let's start with, there's a fiber here that's quite thick, which is sitting right here. We see this fiber running down sideways, a very unusual placement, and you can see it right here. So this is the same eye. We have a little bit of a lacuna here. It's actually right there as well. So as we have got a better light source, as we have a higher resolution, we see detail more clearly, but it's the light and the camera brand that have altered our color here. So now we need to look and see, what about pigment? Well, this little pigment right here, which is at about 41 minutes, should be sitting right about here. And there's a tiny hint that there might be a pigment starting right there. If this pigment right here should be sitting right in this area, it wasn't there 20 years earlier. Right. This pigment should be sitting right in here, but it's not. So these are pigments that have developed over time. Again, color tells us organ, placement, organ of origin, placement tells us which organ is likely going to be impacted. When I'm working with things like this, I will work with the organ that's being impacted if it's showing symptoms. If it's not showing symptoms, I will simply focus on the organ of origin, right? Because if I focus on organ of origin, I'm going to be having a positive impact on every organ that wants to be impacted by this pigment. Does that make sense? So rather than addressing every single organ here, I just address the organ of origin, and I know I'm doing a good job of working with everything. This is where having your anatomy and physiology under your belt is so critical, because if you, I'm going to pop back for one, if you don't understand how the liver can affect the organ that this is sitting in and the organ that this is sitting in, and the organ that this is sitting in and this one, you may not know what would be an excellent a way to approach this, right? And so important that we understand anatomy and physiology. If you've looked at eyes, particularly usually of older people, you will have likely seen a ring like this. This is called a lipemic diathesis. Over time, it will appear. Rarely will we see these in children under 20. More commonly, we see them in people over 60, and to varying degrees. Although I'll tell you, recently I'm seeing more of them in 20 and 30-year-olds. This is not an iris sign. This is in the cornea. Another reason to understand your anatomy and physiology so you understand what the cornea is. The lipemic diathesis can appear over time. It may gradually build and become more opaque. It may become wider. And it may start as just a sliver at one aspect of the limbus of the iris, but it may develop and become a complete circle. So we're not going to help this person dissolve this sign. When we understand what this sign means and where it comes from, we then understand the pathways we need to do to correct the chemistry in the body. Again, it's not going to dissolve this, but by addressing the chemistry, we are able to prevent further breakdown of that tissue and possibly reverse the impact it's having within the body as a whole. And that's what we want to do. I don't care if I change the iris. I mean, you can go and get colored contacts if that's what you want to do, right? What I'm more concerned about is what the iris is teaching me about how their body is working and how it wants to work genetically. And I'm more concerned about changing the person's health, about improving what's going on. Do you agree with me that that is what we want to do? Who cares what how the iris changes? Because it's not going to change in positive ways. We want to have that impact on the person's health. Vienna, thank you for saying you agree with me that the health is more important than trying to change the eyes. We know that pupil shape may change. This can be a dynamic indicator. The pupil shape has a very strong correlation to spinal alignment and nervous system function. When we see flattenings in the pupil, it tells us that we are likely seeing an interruption in the nerve feed that is being triggered by subluxations in the spine. When we understand where the flattening is on that pupillary edge, and it's actually not the pupil that's changing shape. I mean, in truth, the pupil is a hole, right? The pupil is just a hole. What's changing shape truly is the edge of the iris. And when we see that edge of the iris becoming flat, it makes it look like the pupil has changed its shape. We can correlate this to different locations on the spine. And when we do that, we know which part of the spine needs to be worked on. Now, I'm not a chiropractor. I'm not a massage therapist. I'm not an osteopath. I can't do that kind of physical work. But when I see this, I can then ask appropriate questions about organ function, about symptoms. And I can then recommend that they work with someone who does the physical work. I can send them to a physiotherapist or a chiropractor or an osteopath and get them to work on that kind of stuff. This can also be impacted by emotions because we know emotion affects structure and function, right? And so we can do a lot of recommendations of things to help our client improve the function, improve the alignment of the spine, which improves the functioning of the nervous system, which improves the functioning of the organs. So in this case, we would like to see that round out. I will tell you it's hard work. I have yet to see a client who will do all of the necessary work to actually round that out and hold it round. Where we really want to pay attention, and this is really important for constitutional iridologists. As constitutionalists, we also study the sclera. So where the iris is all about genetic predispositions, what has been passed down from one generation to the next, for the last 3 or 4 generations, the sclera is about what is this person doing with their body. So as we look at this, I want you to look for a few things. First off, look at the blood vessel down here. It's not very prominent. Look at how much thicker it is now, nearly 20 years later. Look at this blood vessel up here, which is sitting right here. Notice it's gotten fainter. It's changed. Notice this blood vessel here, and notice how it's gotten a little thicker, a little more prominent. So this is where we see dynamic changes. This is where, if we are doing the right kinds of protocols, it's more easy to see a change. When we see something in the sclera and the client doesn't yet have symptoms, it's a warning that something is brewing. Something may be building, and we want to ask appropriate questions and create appropriate recommendations. Now, we also want to take what we see in the sclera, juxtapose that against what we see in the iris, balance that out with the client's symptoms to create the questions and the program. Right? We want to see, does what we see in the sclera have some kind of a genetic predisposition showing up in the iris? If it does, we know it's going to be a little bit harder to move this. If it doesn't, we know this is truly the person's done this to themselves. And it should be easier to move this if it's not too deeply set. We need to make sure we have really good imaging devices to do sclera photography. You will never get good iris or good sclera photos with a smartphone or with a $300 iriscope kind of machine. You need to have a camera that will allow you to change the shutter speed, to adjust the flash intensity, things like that, in order to get good sclera photos. And those are some of the extra things that we touch on and spend time on actually in the dynamic iridology course. What about ways irides do not change? Now, when I was first taught iridology, I was taught that when we saw a lacuna, those of you who have a Jensen background might call this a lesion. We call them lacunae. We were taught that anytime there were fibers inside that, it meant that healing was happening. That is not true. What it means is the iris is made up of layers of fiber structure. And this simply means the top layer of fiber structure has an opening, and we are seeing the next layer of fiber below that. We are not going to add fibers to an iris. We are not going to take fibers away from an iris. The fibers are genetically determined, much like your fingerprint is genetically determined. This is one of the reasons why they can use an iris scan and a retinal scan to positively ID people, right? Because the fiber structure of your iris does not change. People will look at photos like this. These are actually 3 photos of the same eye taken with 2 different cameras. So these first images were taken with the same camera on the same day, slightly different settings. Notice that the colors, the skin tones, the iris color, even the sclera color are slightly different. So we've got slightly different camera settings going on here. When we look at this with the large pupil, notice how compressed the iris tissue is, and how that makes the lacunae, it makes it look like they've changed their shape. As the pupil gets smaller, notice how that shape alters slightly. And when the pupil is the smallest that we've got it, notice how different those lacunae shapes appear. I want you to consider that these lacunae, think of them like a balloon that has a certain amount of air in it. When you stretch it, it still has the same amount of air or the same amount of volume. When you compress it, it has the same amount of volume. That's exactly what we're looking at here. So lacunae do not change. They do not get smaller, but their shape can be morphed, not permanently changed, but morphed temporarily based on pupil size. Deanne says, it is harder to view someone with a really dark eye. This is why you need a good proper camera setup. With a proper camera setup, you can change the intensity of the light and add more light to do the iris photos so that you can see more detail. And then you can turn the light down to get better sclera photos so you can see the detail there. So it's not harder to view someone with a really dark eye. You just have to understand the technology. Kimberly Zadalis, who is one of my recently certified students, love that, said this: if you are wondering which iridology course to take, you can stop looking, you've found it. Judith Cobb is an excellent instructor with many years of experience. She is a caring and compassionate person who is dedicated to the field of iridology and her students. I personally practice both Eastern and Western physiology medicine and was very impressed with the layout of her program. She makes it easy for her students to balance work, life, and study. I love that. The dynamic iridology assessment system is the only live, online, fully mentored course for nutritionists, herbalists, naturopaths, registered nurses, EMTs, LMTs who want to streamline their clinical work without sacrificing client care. When you understand iridology well, you can assess your client and create a protocol in under 75 minutes and still have plenty of time to create rapport. The idea here is that so many holistic professionals see their client, gather information, then go off and spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours of their own time creating a program to either email to their client or to deliver to their client at a later date. Challenge is they're not getting paid for that extra time they're spending creating a program. Wouldn't it make so much more sense to get all your work done when you're with your client, get paid for the actual time you are working, and free up time to see more clients or have a life or take a nap, whatever you want, right? That's why I teach iridology the way I teach it. Iridology the way I teach it will help you do faster assessments, be more accurate, have better and faster rapport, and it eliminates the need for an intake form. You always want a signed informed consent form, but you do not need to give your clients an intake questionnaire. Waste of time. Vienna says, I've done that in my integrative practice. Yeah, meaning that she's spent hours creating protocols. Not a great way to run a business. The next live course will be starting on June the 8th. Again, you have to have anatomy and physiology under your belt. And if you've got that, then I invite you, and we've got a few more eyes to look at, I invite you to use this URL, which I should have had where I could copy and paste it, and I do not. Dynamic-iridology-insight. I invite you to use that URL that I just pasted in the chat box to schedule a one-on-one Zoom meeting with me. This is not a high-pressure sales call. It is truly to assess whether you've got the prerequisites and whether you're a good fit for the course. At the end, we go over all of the details in a one-on-one Zoom so that I can answer all your questions about the tuition, the payment plans, how long the course is, your time commitment, what's included in the course, how it prepares you for certification. Yeah, we want to make sure we cover that so that I answer all of your specific questions and make sure you're feeling satisfied and happy, and actually to make sure that we like each other well enough to work together, right? That's important. We need rapport, right? I don't accept everybody into the course. I want people that I know we can work well together. So important. Karen Choate said, and she is a certified iridologist. She did certify with IPA. Judith has been one of the teachers who's made a difference in my life. She's a born teacher, meaning she has incredible knowledge to share in her field of expertise, patience with her students, whether you are completely new to the field or a person who's taken iridology courses with other teachers, and most importantly, the passion to ensure all of her students are well-versed, comfortable with what they've learned, and are poised for success. Judith has always been generous with her time and is always willing to discuss any questions that I occasionally have had with unusual cases in my practice. We actually have twice per month office hours where you can ask any questions you want. My students and my grads come to those to ask questions and discuss cases. I began implementing what I had learned in her course into my practice before I'd even finished her classes, and it has been an invaluable tool in my office. I cannot say enough about Judith and any course that she teaches. If you are considering studying iridology, look no further. So with that, my friends, again, I guess I don't have more iPhotos, my mistake. I invite you to schedule a one-on-one if you've got your A&P. If you don't have A&P, reach out to me on social media. I am happy to connect you with the A&P course that I recommend and that has been approved of by IPA as meeting their requirements, right? If you're going to do an A&P course, you might as well do one that's already been approved, so you know that once you've finished it with your 80% or better, you are golden to move forward with learning iridology. And so with that, I do invite you, use that link that I posted in the chat box a few moments ago, and schedule a one-on-one with me. Let's talk. Let's see if this is a good fit. Whether it's the June 8th start or a future course, it doesn't matter. We can have that conversation. I hope that's been helpful for you to understand a little bit more about how the eyes change, what you can expect to see, and what you will not see in an iris assessment when you're looking to see what has changed. Did that help you today? Did that give you some insight? Fantastic. Deanne says, yes, thank you. You are most welcome. So good to have you with me today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. I look forward to speaking with you soon. Have a great week. Bye for now.